You are barefoot on cold stone. The candlelight sputters beside you, casting long, nervous shadows across the rough floor of your cell. The monastery is silent, but not in the way a holy place should be. The silence is strained, swollen with breath you can't place, with rustling robes and the soft creak of wood where no monk should be moving at this hour. Your hands tremble as you clutch your rosary, but it's not prayer that keeps you awake tonight. It's the sound from the next cell over, wet, rhythmic, and unmistakable. You were told this place would cleanse your soul. But as the whisper of a name escapes the stone wall beside you, gasped, not spoken, you realize the monastery holds its own kind of sin, one dressed in cassocks and shadow. You came here to escape temptation, to become pure. They said the walls of this abbey would protect you from the flesh, but no one told you what really happens when dozens of men are locked behind stone walls for life, their bodies bound by vows they never stop breaking. You thought monks lived in silence, fasting, chastity. You thought their lives were dry parchment and worn scripture. You thought wrong. Think medieval monks were models of restraint? Think again. Because what the records reveal, the whispered confessions, the papal condemnations, the secret punishments, would make your skin crawl. Forget modern scandals. This wasn't about a few wayward men. This was a system. And what lay hidden beneath those hoods makes modern controversies look like parlor games. Let's shatter the myth, because beneath every Gregorian chant, behind every prayer in Latin, was a body, flesh and bone and desire, that didn't stop hungering just because it was cloaked in a robe. The medieval monk was not a man purified by God. He was a man starved by suppression. And history shows what happens when that hunger grows in the dark. Start with the obvious. The monastic rules were brutal. You were told to avoid the sight of women, to never speak to your fellow brothers of carnal thoughts, to sleep fully clothed, hands outside the blanket. In the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, it says plainly, "Let them sleep clothed and girded with belts or cords, that the young may not have opportunity for evil." You weren't even allowed to shift in bed without risking suspicion. But here's what they didn't print in the rulebook. The sin didn't stop at the door of the dormitory. It waited inside it. Picture this, a line of monks kneeling before dawn, red-eyed and silent, awaiting confession not from guilt, but because it's the only sanctioned way to whisper the cravings that torment them. They kneel one by one in front of the confessor, the only man allowed to hear their secrets. And some confessions are repeated weekly, not because the penance didn't work, but because the sin never stopped. Here's where it gets worse. The same monks who whisper their sins by sunrise are back at it by nightfall. Hidden trysts between cells, special companionships formed in secluded cloisters. Monastic writings from the 12th century reveal a shocking level of coded intimacy between brothers. The Visitation, reports from bishops inspecting monasteries, documented sleeping arrangements that went beyond what any vow permitted. In one 14th century visitation to an English priory, the bishop wrote, "Let it be corrected that the sub-prior sleeps often in the same bed as the novice named Peter, which has caused scandal among the brethren." But don't be fooled into thinking this was rare, because the deeper you look, the more systemic it becomes. In some abbeys, monks formed what can only be described as hidden hierarchies of intimacy, older, powerful monks taking young novices under their protection. Not officially, of course, but protected novices somehow got lighter chores, better food, fewer beatings. The term particular friendships was whispered with fear and envy. And here's where the mask truly slips. Some abbeys became known, notorious even, for their warmth. Not spiritual warmth, physical. Historical records from the monastery of Saint Bertin in the 13th century describe repeated attempts by abbots to suppress habitual sins of the flesh committed among the younger brothers. But the punishments never lasted, because the offenders weren't always punished. Sometimes they were the ones in charge. Can you imagine that? Being a novice of 15, placed under the authority of a monk 3 times your age, confessing to him, serving him, sleeping just a few feet away, and then being told that your urges are a moral failure, but his interest in you is holy mentorship? And if you spoke out, there were punishments for that too. The contradiction is mind-breaking. You are told that desire is the devil's whisper, but you're living in a building where that whisper echoes in every corridor. You're told that even touching yourself in the night is a mortal sin, but you're watched in your sleep, not by angels, but by other men who know the silence of the dormitory too well. And the worst part? Everyone acts like nothing is happening. There's a phrase in monastic writings, silentium nocturnum, night silence. But what it really means is complicity, because under the cloak of that silence, entire abbeys became breeding grounds for secret intimacy, punished and practiced in the same breath. And when the church couldn't stop it, they buried it. They rewrote the reports, or they transferred the worst offenders to other monasteries, just like they would centuries later, in cases that made headlines. But this is where it all began. And this is only the beginning. You haven't even seen the official punishments yet, or what happened when a monk's secret relationship wasn't just whispered about, but found out. Because once the church started to tighten its grip, the horrors didn't stop. They evolved. And the next chapter? It's even darker. You are summoned to the prior's chamber just before matins. It's still dark outside, the air brittle and wet with mist, and you can feel the cold seep through your habit as you cross the cloister barefoot. No one speaks. They never do during these summons. But your breath comes fast, your stomach turns, and the ache in your thighs from kneeling too long in last night's vigil now pulses with a different kind of dread. The wooden door creaks open. Inside, the chamber glows with candlelight and warmth, a comfort denied to the dormitory. The prior is seated, robes perfectly arranged, his voice soft, almost fatherly. He does not ask why you've been brought. He already knows. You've been caught, maybe not in the act, but close enough. A touch too long. A gaze not averted quickly enough. A brother's hands on your shoulders during evening prayers, too lingering to be innocent. But here's the horror. The prior doesn't speak of sin, not at first. He speaks of understanding, of weakness, of how St. Augustine himself wrote of struggling with flesh before finding the light. He speaks of compassion, his compassion. And then, with the same hands that lifted the Eucharist that morning, he places a hand on your face, your shoulder, your neck. You know what's happening. And you also know what happens if you resist. Because beneath the theology, behind the incense, was a truth no one outside the monastery walls ever learned. Confession wasn't just about absolution. It was a hunting ground. Here's what they never taught you in school. In medieval Europe, the greatest violators of the vow of chastity weren't anonymous failures. They were often the most powerful men inside the monastery. Priors, abbots, confessors. Those charged with enforcing purity were also the ones most shielded from its consequences. The evidence is buried in archives and bishopric visitations. In 1279, the Bishop of Lincoln ordered an inquiry into the Abbey of St. Ertzon, Albans. Reports described a culture of unchaste familiarity among the monks, especially between older monks and young oblates. Boys as young as 12 placed into monastic life by their families. The church called them pueri oblati, but within the cloister, many simply called them servants, or worse, favorites. And it wasn't just St. Albans. At the Abbey of St. Augustine in Canterbury, a 14th century investigation uncovered that several senior monks had established long-standing relationships with their subordinates. Relationships, the documents noted, that included intimate knowledge and habitual proximity. That's how they wrote it, carefully, sanitized, but between the lines, years of abuse cloaked in liturgical Latin. But here's where it gets worse. These weren't isolated failings. They were part of a system that allowed silence to be holy, obedience to be weaponized, and pleasure to be regulated not by ethics, but by hierarchy. And the Church, when confronted with these scandals, didn't reform. It recorded them. In 1432, the Diocese of Sion kept a register called Liber Visitationum, listing monasteries visited by church officials and the transgressions they found. At a Benedictine house in what is now Switzerland, the bishop's scribe recorded, "The abbot is said to sleep in chambers with young novices. The brothers murmur but dare not confront, as the punishments are harsher for accusation than for sin." Just think about that. It was more dangerous to report abuse than to commit it. Imagine being 16. You've taken your vows. You've memorized the Psalter. You've fasted through Lent. You believe the monastery is sacred space. Then your mentor, your spiritual father, summons you to his private chamber and begins correcting you with gestures that make your body flinch. You try to speak. He places a finger to your lips. "You must resist temptation," he whispers. "Let me help." The next day, during confession, he asks if you've had impure thoughts. You say yes. He prescribes fasting, silence, and he adds gently, "and return to me after Compline." But here's the sickest part. This wasn't always punished. In fact, sometimes it was promoted. Some monks rose in rank not in spite of their violations, but because of them. An abbot with a reputation for managing temptation was often seen as strong. In 1310, an investigation into the Abbey of Farfa in Italy revealed a strange pattern. Monks with repeated infractions involving other brothers had been assigned teaching roles. The logic? Exposure to temptation was a test of holiness. The result? The monastery became a cloistered hunting ground with theological justification. Can you imagine being trapped in that cycle? You sin. You confess. Your confessor is your abuser. He forgives you. You weep. He comforts you. You return. Again and again. And every time, the sin is yours. The shame is yours. The penance is yours. And the power? That never changes hands. But when the church did act, It didn't protect the victims, it moved the offenders. Or it prescribed humiliating punishments for everyone. You're about to discover how far those punishments went. Because in some monasteries, the penance wasn't spiritual. It was physical, brutal, torturous. And the next time you were caught, it wasn't just prayer or fasting. It was iron chains, stone cells, public flogging. You think this is medieval restraint? Number this was engineered obedience, enforced through psychological war and physical pain. And if you think this system couldn't get any more twisted, wait until you learn what happened when entire communities of monks were found guilty. The solution wasn't excommunication, it was profit. Now that you've witnessed how silence protected predators and confession became currency, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden in history's shadows. If uncovering these buried truths resonates with your hunger to understand the real human experience, not the sanitized version, keep watching. Because the next chapter will show you how the church turned punishment itself into spectacle. Because what happens next? It makes sin look merciful. Now that you've seen how confession became currency and silence became a weapon, you're beginning to understand how deep the corruption truly ran. These aren't isolated horrors. They're patterns of power hidden beneath centuries of theology. Subscribe if you're ready to keep peeling back the layers of history's most guarded lies. This isn't about scandal. It's about truth, the kind they never meant for you to see. You are on your knees in the refectory, not to pray, but to be seen. Your habit is torn open across your back, your arms tied to the legs of a bench, and the brothers sit in silence at their tables, bowls of cold broth untouched. They're not looking at you directly, but they don't look away either. The prior enters last. He walks slowly, deliberately, holding the corded whip in one hand and a scroll in the other. Your name is read aloud. Your crime? Carnal transgression with a brother of equal station, occurring thrice during Lent. Your punishment? Public penance before the brethren. 12 lashes, no garments, 3 weeks of silence, and you are lucky. That's what they tell you afterward. Lucky, because others vanished, or bled longer, or were broken in ways that didn't heal. But here's what no one outside these walls understands. Punishments like this weren't meant to cleanse. They were meant to control, and they were everywhere. By the 13th century, church policy on monastic violations had become standardized, mechanized. The Vatican issued penitentials, vast manuals of sin and consequence, detailing exactly what a monk should suffer for each infraction of the flesh. These were not dusty documents tucked away on shelves. They were used daily, obsessively. If a monk commits sodomy with another, let him be whipped in chapter, eat on the floor for 6 months, and be deprived of all companionship. That's from the penitential of Burchard of Worms, circulated widely across Europe by 1025. If a novice is used as a concubine by his superior and he resists not, he must fast for 1 year and wear chains by night. That appears in the canons of the Council of Chalon-sur-Saône, 813 CE. What they don't say in those manuals is what happens when the punished monk becomes a repeat offender and then a prior, or when the chained novice becomes abbot, because the line between penance and promotion was disturbingly thin. You'd expect these punishments to have stopped the behavior. But what history shows is the opposite. The more the church punished, the more creative monks became. They didn't stop sinning. They just became better at hiding it. The Abbey of St. Peter in Ghent documented 17 separate cases of relapsed transgressors in a single year. The solution: they built a new penance chamber with iron rings and soundproofed walls. It was cheaper than expulsion. But here's where it gets truly twisted. Some monasteries turn punishment itself into a ritual of spectacle, a performance, a message. You are dragged into the cloister garth at dawn. The grass is wet with dew. The community stands in a ring. You are stripped, bound, and paraded, not for what you did, but to make sure others know they will be next. Your face is smeared with ash. A wooden sign hangs around your neck. Luxuria, lust. And then the chant begins, because the floggings were not just beatings. They were liturgies. Monks sang psalms as they struck each other. The rhythm of the lashes matched the verses. It was orchestrated humiliation, devotional violence. At the Abbey of Cluny in 1157, visiting bishops noted that such punishments were conducted with reverent solemnity so as to remind the brothers of divine justice. But hidden in that phrase is something darker. Because the very monks doing the whipping, many were repeat offenders themselves. And this performance wasn't about morality. It was about maintaining the illusion of control. And behind that illusion, profit was growing. Because monasteries didn't just punish, they capitalized. You see, sin had a price, literally. By the 14th century, some monasteries began collecting fines in place of penance. A wealthy monk caught with a companion? Pay 5 soli dei and say 12 Ave Marias. An oblate caught with another novice? Flogged in the yard, publicly. Poor monks paid in skin, rich ones paid in coin. Records from the Abbey of St. Gall list over 200 such redemptions between 1371 and 1380. The revenues funded a new scriptorium. And when bishops questioned the practice, the abbot argued, "It is better that coins serve God than flesh serves Satan." But here's the part that will make your breath catch. In some places, punishments weren't even administered by the church. They were auctioned. In 1412, at a Cistercian house in Bohemia, a monk guilty of intimacy unbecoming was sentenced to 12 lashes. But the chapter house minutes record something chilling. The right to strike shall be given to the highest bidder among the brethren. That's right. Monks paid to beat one another. This wasn't just control. It was entertainment. Imagine the fear that instilled in you, knowing that your pain could become someone else's reward, knowing that behind every whispered prayer, every bowed head was a brother waiting to make your humiliation his moment of power. The church always claimed these punishments were to cleanse the soul. But the deeper you look, the more it becomes clear. It wasn't the sin that horrified them. It was the exposure. Because sin in silence, that could be managed, hidden, leveraged. But sin revealed, that required blood. And if the spectacle grew large enough, it wasn't just the brothers who watched. Villagers were sometimes invited in. During Passiontide, some monasteries staged public penance for wayward brothers. Outside the Abbey of Fontenelle, a brother caught with a visiting monk was paraded through the village with a crown of thorns. He was forced to crawl up the steps of the church as townspeople threw rotten food and called him Bride of Beelzebub. That scene, half ritual, half theater, was recorded by a local priest in 1324. Thus did the house restore its dignity before men, and God was satisfied. But was he? Because when those brothers returned to the cloister, scarred, humiliated, broken, nothing changed. The same rooms, the same eyes, the same desires. You begin to realize this wasn't about redemption. This was about power. A system designed to wound you into obedience, to scar you into silence. And the worst wounds? They weren't the ones on your back. They were the ones you inflicted on yourself, just to survive. But you haven't seen what happens when entire monasteries fall together, when sin becomes not individual, but collective. Because what comes next? It's not punishment. It's policy. And it's going to change everything. You arrive at a new monastery, transferred without explanation, barely given time to gather your meager belongings. The brothers here do not ask questions. They do not speak of your past. And when you kneel beside them during Vespers, they chant perfectly, eyes downcast, lips moving in unison, like men who have learned that silence isn't just sacred, it's survival. But something is wrong here. You feel it the moment the abbot blesses you. His hand lingers too long on your shoulder. His eyes scan you, not as a fellow brother, but as inventory, a calculation, not the gaze of a shepherd, but of a merchant. And before the week ends, you understand why. This monastery sells indulgences, but not just to the laity, not just for coin. It trades in sin, and it profits in silence. Because here, the rules are flexible, for a price. By the late 14th century, some monastic orders had transformed their institutions from houses of discipline into markets of negotiated purity. Confess, pay, continue. Even repeated offenses were tolerated, so long as the offender could offer something in return. Coin, labor, connections. At the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, an abbot named Lambert was accused of establishing a tariff system for monastic sins. The records, preserved in the Diocesan Register of Tours, are chillingly precise. Carnal contact with a fellow brother, 4 livres. Carnal contact with an outsider, 8 livres. Repeated contact with novices, confession weekly, fine doubled. But here's what makes it worse. The fines weren't used for penance. They funded expansion. The abbey constructed new guest quarters, a library, a rose garden, all built with the silver rung from hidden shame. The Bishop of Tours, upon discovering this, did not dismantle the system. He demanded a portion of the revenue. Sin had become a franchise. You think this is exaggerated? Consider the case of Cluny Abbey, one of the largest and wealthiest religious institutions in medieval Europe. Cluny should have been a beacon of sanctity. Instead, documents from papal visitations in 1472 reveal that a thriving network of special permissions existed for senior monks. These included private rooms, exemption from communal sleeping quarters, and spiritual companionships with junior monks. The phrase spiritual companionship appears over 200 times in the visitation records, and when questioned, the monks defended the practice as a means of preventing greater evils. That's what they called it, preventing greater evils. But the most disturbing example comes from the monastery of Saint-Martin in Cologne. You are standing in the library there, tasked with copying texts. The elder monk beside you, Brother Henricus, leans in too close as he adjusts your script, his breath hot on your ear. Later that night, he visits your cell. The next morning, You report it to the prior. But the prior already knows. Brother Henricus donates wine from his family estate. His father is a patron of the bishop. You're told to pray for discernment. Told to reflect on whether you may have invited temptation. Told in essence to forget it happened. And when you don't forget, when you mention it again, you're moved to cellar duty. Alone. Out of sight. Because in this system, the sinner is protected. The witness is punished. This wasn't just happening in one monastery. It was an open secret across Christendom. A letter from Archbishop Arnaud of Narbonne, dated 1315, speaks plainly. Too many houses do not expel the offender but shelter him, because his purse outweighs his crime. In Spain, at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, papal legates uncovered an entire wing of private cells reserved for visiting nobles turned monks, men whose vows were purchased, whose sins were pre-forgiven. The locals called that wing the Golden Cloister. Few novices ever entered it. Those who did returned quiet, withdrawn, changed. But here's where the corruption reached something more dangerous than hypocrisy. It reached policy. Because some abbots began using sin not as something to suppress, but something to manage, to balance, to weaponize. You are in the chapter house. The abbot is reviewing your week's duties. He pauses, says he's heard rumors. Do you wish to confess anything? He asks. You hesitate. He leans in. Perhaps something with Brother Mathieu? You say nothing. He smiles. Then I will consider the matter closed, and you will begin working in the archive. And just like that, the game changes. Now he owns you. Because what you didn't confess, what he says you didn't confess, can be used at any time. If you displease him, it becomes public. If you obey, it disappears. In this world, silence isn't protection. It's leverage. Confession becomes a trap, not a path to forgiveness, but a hook in your mouth, an invisible leash. And here's what that does to a man. It teaches you that survival is not about holiness. It's about calculation, about knowing who to trust, what not to say, when to kneel, how to listen through walls. The monastery is no longer a sanctuary. It's a chessboard. Every brother, a piece. Every cell a square. And those who don't learn fast, they don't last. Some go mad, whispering Latin verses through the night. Others take penance too far, fasting until their bones show, flagellating until they collapse, trying to beat the sin out of themselves before someone else does. But some adapt. They become what the church rewards: quiet, useful, obedient. They keep secrets, even when the secrets involve more than just two brothers, because what you're about to see next is what happens when a monastery doesn't just tolerate sin, but becomes its architect. You've seen the corruption of individuals. Next, you'll see the rise of entire monastic orders built on exploitation. Orders that traded vows of poverty for wealth, vows of chastity for indulgence, and vows of silence for empire. You're not leaving the cloister anymore. You're descending into its depths. And what waits there will haunt you. You've been transferred again. This time, not for punishment, not even for scandal. You've been chosen. The parchment delivered by horseback called it honorable service. A summons to the great house of the knights, hospitaller, monks in armor, warriors cloaked in vows. You arrive expecting severity, maybe discipline. But what you find instead is a fortress of control. Order without mercy, silence without sanctity. At first, it looks like holiness. Endless prayer schedules, military drills between psalms. But soon, the patterns start to emerge. Always the same monks assigned to night vigil. Always the same doors left unlocked. Always the same novices disappearing before sunrise and returning with hollow eyes. And here, they don't even pretend to confess it. Because in the military orders, sin wasn't a stain, it was a tool. By the 13th century, monastic military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller had become powerful beyond comprehension. They controlled land, currency, and influence across Europe and the Levant. And behind their austere facades lay private quarters sealed tighter than any fortress wall. Inside those chambers, desire wore iron. Historical records confirm it. In 1308, during the suppression of the Templars by King Philip IV of France, dozens of knights confessed under interrogation to obscene kisses, ritualized sodomy, and oaths sworn on the buttock or genitals of senior knights. Some historians dismiss these as confessions tortured from the innocent, but documents uncovered from the Inquisition files, held in the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, suggest something far more systematic. A Templar named Brother Hugh testified that the act was commanded, not desired. It was a trial of loyalty, not of lust. Think about that. What if sin was not forbidden, but required? You kneel in the chapel, surrounded by stone and steel. Your superior leans down during the blessing and whispers, "Tonight, your loyalty will be tested." You are led not to a confessional, not to a cell, but to a chamber lit by torchlight, where another novice waits, naked, trembling, eyes downcast. A ritual, they say, an initiation, and when you resist, they remind you, you are nothing without obedience. You pass the test, or you are broken trying. But here's the nightmare. Once you've crossed that line, there is no way back, because now you belong to them, fully. Your guilt is their leash, and your silence? It's the proof that you understand the game. This wasn't isolated. In 1311, the Council of Vienne, convened by Pope Clement V, reviewed accusations of heretical behavior within the Templars. The testimonies speak in careful language, but between the lines lie damning truths. Brothers were required to abandon flesh, not in body, but in loyalty to any outside the order. The body was a currency, not to be denied, but to be controlled. And the Hospitallers, they weren't exempt. In Rhodes, their headquarters from 1310 to 1522, documents record dozens of disciplinary actions, nearly all against external violations. Relations with women, contact with outsiders, but internal misconduct rarely mentioned, because it wasn't punished. It was protected. The higher your rank, the less you were questioned. A novice caught whispering too long to another brother might be lashed, but a commander who took a servant boy into his chamber night after night, he was called strict. And in some cases, this is the part that turns your stomach, boys were not simply servants, they were tributes. In lands controlled by the military orders, peasants paid taxes not just in coin, but in bodies. Local records from the 14th century Gascony describe youths pledged to the Order for Pious Service. The documents claim they worked kitchens or copied texts, but cross-reference them with monastic rosters, and you see the truth. Dozens of them disappeared from the rolls within months. No death records, no transfer notes, just erased. And in some fortresses, Especially those along trade routes, there were separate quarters. Rooms not assigned to any monk. Rooms with locks only senior knights had keys for. Archaeological digs at the former Hospitaller stronghold in Bodrum, Turkey, uncovered cells with unusually small beds. Not monks' quarters, not storage. Too isolated for scribes, too ornate for servants, but exactly right for guests. This wasn't discipline gone wrong. This was indulgence institutionalized. And here's the final twist. It was justified not as sin, but as sacrifice. You are told that denying a woman is holy, but you are also told that the body must release its poison, that the order cannot afford distraction, that brotherly correction between those who serve God is different, necessary. Do you see what's happened? The church built walls to keep out temptation, but in doing so, it sealed it inside. And once inside, desire changed form. It no longer looked like lust. It looked like loyalty. And by the time you realize that obedience is the real vice, not pleasure, it's too late. You've sworn your soul to a system that calls submission salvation. You think it ends there? Because what happens next doesn't even pretend to be hidden. The mask slips entirely. You're about to see what happens when an entire monastery, from abbot to cellarer, decides that everyone is for sale. Not just to each other, but to the highest bidder. You are standing behind the altar, not as a priest, but as a product. Your robe is clean, your face downturned. You are silent as instructed. Around you nobles whisper, merchants watch, and the abbot smiles. Tonight isn't a mass, it's a transaction. Because at the Abbey of Saint-Florian in 15th century Austria, there are no more illusions. The final veil has fallen. The monastery doesn't just conceal sin, it commodifies it. We begin in the chapter house, where ledgers are kept. Not ledgers of wheat or wine. Ledgers of names, young monks, oblates, choir boys, their heights, their voices, their ages, marked with codes, amenable, trained, devout. Each name is followed by a column of numbers. Donations. Benedict, 14 years, 5 florins. Matthias, 16 years, 8 florins. Returned, not expelled, not excommunicated, returned, as if he were a defective shipment. These records, discovered in 1897 and published in part by the historian Otto Gruber, detail a decades-long operation inside the abbey, one that combines spiritual discipline with quiet exploitation. Wealthy patrons would visit for retreat. Donations would be made, and certain novices would be assigned to hospitality duty. The donations increased depending on what the guest required. One document, now stored in the Archdiocese Archive of Linz, reads plainly, "Assign Brother Lucas to Lord V for duration of stay. Ensure discretion. Provide psalm books and wine." This wasn't rumor. This was policy. And Saint Florian wasn't alone. In northern Italy, the Camaldolese order maintained private guest houses known as Domus Pacis, houses of peace. They were advertised for rest, recovery, and spiritual rejuvenation. But internal records show that 1 in 5 guests made private donations directly to the chamberlain responsible for novice placements. One confession, preserved in the Inquisition records of Bologna, recounts a merchant describing his stay. "The brother assigned to me was gentle, well-spoken, and knew not only the Psalms, but also How to Make One Forget the World. I was asked afterward if I wished to support his continued training. I gave 20 florins. I never saw him again. What makes this the most horrifying revelation? There were no secrets anymore. This was normalized, institutional, practiced with ritual precision. The abbot's blessing was not a prayer, it was a price tag. The novices selected weren't coerced by violence, but by theology. They were told that service, even of the body, was sacrifice. That obedience in any form was sacred. That enduring shame silently was closer to Christ. And many believed it. Can you imagine that? Believing that every degradation endured was pleasing to God? That your pain was holy? That the buyer was not defiling you, but elevating you? At the Abbey of Santa Maria di Porto Nuovo in the 15th century, the monks even crafted liturgies to accompany such arrangements. One psalm cycle written in the margins of a guest register contains verses that twist Scripture into submission. He who suffers in silence earns the crown unseen. The lamb does not resist the shepherd's hand, though it be heavy. By the time you realize what you've been made into, it's already too late. You're known. You're expected. The visitors ask for you by name. And worse, some of the other brothers envy you. Because in this world, being chosen means you eat better, sleep longer, are spared from the harder labor. Others are flogged. You are praised. It poisons your soul in silence. Until one night, you watch a new novice brought in, barely old enough to speak the Latin responses. He's assigned to clean the abbot's study. He stumbles over a psalm. The abbot doesn't smile. Later that night, you hear his weeping through the thin walls. You do nothing, because now you are part of the system, not a victim, a cog. And here is where the story reaches its climax. In 1503, at the Monastery of Lenin in Brandenburg, a noblewoman named Clara von Rosenthal lodged a complaint with the Bishop of Havelberg. Her son, sent to the abbey at age 12, returned a year later frail, silent, and unwilling to speak. Under pressure, he revealed that he had been used not only by brothers, but also by visiting clergy. The investigation that followed uncovered 2 decades of systematic abuse tied to donations, indulgences, and theological justifications. The bishop ordered the abbey closed. But it wasn't. 3 years later, the same monastery reopened under new leadership, with the same practices. Only the names changed, because the real sin wasn't what they did. It was how normal it had become. You came into this journey believing monks lived in silence and scripture, that they denied the flesh to elevate the soul, that cloisters were places of peace. Now you've seen what lies behind the veil. That silence can become complicity. That obedience can become weapon. That devotion, twisted by power, can become something unspeakably cruel. But this isn't just history. It's a reminder that systems built on shame and control never vanish. They evolve. They survive behind robes, behind titles, behind holy words, and the only way to confront them is to name them. You now know what history tried to bury. If this journey into the shadows of faith has awakened your hunger to see the past as it truly was, not how it was taught, then keep going. Because the veil has only just begun to lift, and the deeper truths, they're waiting right beneath the silence. You began this story believing monasteries were sanctuaries. Now you know they could be markets of flesh, cloaked in ritual and incense. Subscribe if seeing history's forbidden side sharpens your sense of what power really looks like. There are more hidden chapters, more truths buried in stone that you deserve to uncover.